Thanks for being with us, everybody. Happy Friday. We are glad to have you with us for our Friday 5 Live conversation. And if you have any questions or comments that come up during the session, just use your chat feature. And please be sure that your setting is adjusted to everyone when you submit your questions and comments. And you all will have access to the recording next week. If you're a GoToKnowledge member, the recording will be on your dashboard, and otherwise we will email it to you. And our host today is Meg Foster. Meg Foster has spent 20 years in higher education, focused on student success initiatives and working in areas such as orientation, faculty development, online learning, student leadership, and first-year initiatives. And Meg, I will pass it over to you now.
Thanks, Melissa, and happy Friday, everyone. We've made it to February. January only felt like 300 days long. So we hope everybody's having a great start to the month. And has some plans for rest and renewal this weekend. That's always very important. Just as a reminder, please do put in any questions that you might have in the chat. We'll make sure, while I've prepared questions today, we always love hearing from you all and the things that you would like us to discuss. So we are very fortunate to have with us today Celia Esposito-Noy. We will use doctor only when asked to do so. And as many of you might be aware, we've created this kind of conversations on leadership this academic year in memory of dear colleague Denise Sweat, who had spent really her career in the California Community College system, touching the lives of many colleagues and many students as well. And so we're taking some time during Friday 5 Lives, both in the fall and also the spring semester, to have some conversations regarding leadership, which was an important calling to Denise. So grateful to have Celia with us today. I mean, your career has really spanned the gamut in higher education. You're currently the superintendent and president of Solano Community College, from which I understand is in the Bay Area, but you have worked in all variety of manners in the world of higher education. And we're so fortunate to have your vision, that knowledge base that you bring with you today as we kind of talk through leadership. So welcome, Celia.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks to Innovative Educators for hosting this series in honor of my former colleague, Denise Sweat. She and I, as I was sharing with Melissa a little earlier, we always ran into each other. While we never worked together at the same institution, we always were working collaboratively throughout our careers in the California Community College system. So I do miss her. She was really a wonderful colleague for many of us, especially those of us who came out of student services. So thank you for hosting in her honor.
Yes, she, was always not afraid to ask the question, and she definitely loved to keep me on my toes when we would have conversations in this venue. So I always find such value, as even though, I've spent 20 years in higher education, and I always say that I dye my hair because of that work. I'm sure many of us have as well. I always love hearing how folks come to kind of a leadership position, because, there's not really one size fits all. And I'm seeing more trends of folks who have come out of student services moving into presidency positions, particularly in kind of community colleges. So Celia, would love to kind of hear from you about sort of your journey to where you are now, if that.
Well, I often say, half jokingly, that you end up in these positions when you don't do proper career planning, because there is nothing about my past or even my career that would necessarily lead me here. Folks who I've worked with for many years know that I always said, oh no, I'm not going to be a president, no way. Because I had a great time being a vice president of student services for 10 years. And I always say, though, that's one of the coveted positions, because you are not serving in that capacity where you are always out there representing the college, and you get to do some incredible behind the scenes work to really shift the culture of an institution. And you're held at a different level of accountability. And it gives you a little bit more freedom than when you move into these presidencies. So I've been in this position here at Solano College now. I just am starting my 7th year. And I think I get double years for the COVID years as a president, because they felt like dog years, and we're not done yet. But prior to that, I actually started my career at Chabot College in Hayward as the tutoring center supervisor. And I had no plans of working in higher ed. I was, like I share with many folks, supposed to go to law school like everybody else was at the time. I had an interest in doing policy work. I'd done some community work before that, but I found myself attracted to college campus. Maybe I was romanticizing about my time in student government and as a student, and how wonderful that was. And I thought, well, I could do that for a job. So that's really how I got started in this system. And then I found a graduate program that was designed for folks who want to work in higher ed administration. And so I took a year to go do that job, and then I worked in private, a very small private, I call it funky little college in San Francisco. It doesn't exist anymore, but really learned some innovative strategies and different ways of thinking about what does educational leadership look like. But I did miss the call from the community colleges. And so that's when I decided to return and have been working in the California Community College system since then. So I started in '89. I took a break for a few years in the '90s, and then I returned in '98 and have been in the system since then.
And I think I love hearing how, your experiences have kind of given you this perspective that you're able to sort of look at things a little bit differently, maybe, because and I'd love to hear from you your thoughts about kind of leading from this place in a system. That is an experience, as we've talked about. I'm in the community college system in Virginia, and we're 23 institutions, and we have some independence and some things that are, it's very much we're going to work as a system. We also laugh. I'm sure this is our bias. I'm sure I would be curious to see if California has this same feeling. There is a feeling sometimes that the closer you are to the central office, for the more the magnifying glass is on you, right? And then as you get farther and farther away geographically, our perception is there's more freedom in those outer limits. I'm sure that's not the reality, but the perception. So yeah, would love kind of what, as you've been in the system now for, just a couple of decades, right? And I'm sure you've seen enormous change. I'm sure you've also seen some times where we've returned to things. One of my mentors has a saying, like, the old will be made new again, right? They're like, well, we actually did this, but it's all new this time. So
oh, yeah. It's like bad fashion. It always comes back around maybe every decade or so. And that is the case, I think, in this system and anything that we refer to as a system. Folks believe that the community college system is open access and designed to address these inequities and barriers. And I have to say, and maybe it's because I've been doing this for 30 some years, I don't see it that way. We have developed barriers that make it challenging even to do the application for the community college system. And there's some research that shows the percentage of folks who start the application and then abandon it at some point. Before AB 705, we had all of these ways in which we kept students from accessing college level math and English. And one of the interesting things that I used to always say during that time was, at a private research university, as a student, I could just write a letter to the instructor saying, I'd like to take your third year law class, and explain why I thought I could do it. And I was in. And we set up these really difficult roadblocks for students. And yet we talk about that as a way to ensure their success. While we're trying to balance that with access. So for me, I have a lot of criticism about our current system and the role I've played in that as a leader, and to what extent in my current position am I willing to push back on that? So that for me is sort of the big challenge that we have, really not just now, but really every decade or so. I think the leadership, we need to turn around and take a look and say, what have we been complying with that we should not be? folks know that I've been very vocal about my concern about college athletics. And I don't mean just NCAA, I also mean our local statewide association. And I often will say that student athletics is the last of legalized indentured servitude. And how we set limits for our student athletes. And then what is our responsibility as leaders to say, we're not going to do that. Why are we arguing about whether or not we're going to feed our student athletes before they go to a competition? Why are we having that conversation? So that's why I'm saying these are the sorts of things that I think come back around over and over. And of course, during, you know, a 30+ year career, how I've responded to those issues has changed over time. And I will say to those of you who are younger and out there at the start of your career, you may get to a point where you feel like, you know what, it's time to take the risk and to push back on these conventional notions that we have accepted and that I've been leading as a part of a system. So I really encourage us to do that as we go through our careers.
Any advice on how to do that? Because, you know, sometimes we laugh in meetings that change is like water on a rock. Like it's, you know, in higher ed institutions. And this also is a second question. I mean, we're not known for changing quickly, right? And there's some probably good to that. But I also think, you know, you and I've talked about higher ed is very different and maybe we need to respond more quickly. So, so sorry to give you a two-part question there, but.
I think one of the ways is that, you know, we don't do any of this by ourselves. You have to become part of and build a solid team of folks. And they're not folks who always think the way you do, but those who might push back. You know, when folks will say, well, how do you go about looking for a job? And I said, well, it's not the title and it's not the salary. It's who I will work for and who I will work with, because that for me always has determined my success. You know, what part of a team am I going to contribute to? What part of a team am I going to help build? And I think that's an important piece of this. And then, of course, collectively, it feels a little easier to take risks and to push back when you're not there doing it just by yourself. Now, there are many folks who have done this by themselves, really pushed back on some concepts that really required revisiting. And so I appreciate those who have done the work for many of us. And I think we have a responsibility to keep pushing back and to continue questioning how we are doing this work. And are we really contributing to transformation? Or are we just reproducing inequities in different settings or in different formats?
Mm-hmm. It's important. And you make such a great point about not the title, not the salary, it's the people, right, that we're working with. And I've often said I can do just about anything if I'm part of a good team, if I'm surrounded by good people that I'm excited about working with, that make me feel energized. And
yeah.
Well, so as we think about, you know, this notion of like of change, of making, of examining our systems, that, and I can think of so many, you know, you mentioned in the days before when there was developmental and remedial education. Be fascinated to know on the call if our system has moved away from those kinds of classes as well. How many of us are in places that aren't using those sorts of courses anymore for lots of very valid reasons, like we understand what a barrier it is to degree completion. But as we look at those sorts of barriers that we create, is there any recommendations, any advice you have for us on, you know, we're pulling in our good team. How do we begin to say, this is something we need to change? And I don't know, are there systems that you're like, oh, this has been a particularly, you know, design agencies and things that you're like, this has really helped us move forward? Not just in, I think we're all pretty good at identifying sometimes the barriers, right? But then at making that transition to shift.
Well, I think sometimes we operate off of these assumptions or understandings that we believe are mandated, when in fact they might just be interpretations. And even if they are mandated, why are we not saying, well, you know, I get that that was established in 1973, and maybe it's time for us to revisit that. I think that is really critical when we're talking about transformative leadership, is we have to challenge all of these notions. You know, I had an opportunity, as probably many of us have during the pandemic, where we were using the CARES money to support staff who were working from home by providing them with a stipend to, you know, for resources. And much to the credit of a student worker, he came to me and he said, well, what about the rest of us who are working from home on behalf of the college? Where's our stipend? I said, you're right. We completely missed that for our temporary classified and first student workers. And so we made sure to provide them with the same financial assistance so that they could continue working for us. And what was interesting is that this is an individual that some folks really sort of, you know, felt uncomfortable when the individual pushed back or questioned us. And I said, that's the type of person we have got to welcome into our circle, to really push back on these conventional notions about sort of how we do things and say, well, what about over here? Why aren't we doing this? So, you know, I want to sort of transition and talk a little bit about the pandemic and sort of how that has created opportunities for us to be thinking differently, and really to invite folks in to push back a little bit on those notions of how we operate and how we do business here. As folks know, in California, the Ed Code is very prescriptive. California Community College system still sort of is under the K-14 umbrella. And a lot of what we do is really K-12-ish, as I like to call it, and quite restrictive. And so one of the things that we've been able to do during the pandemic is say, well, wait a minute, we have to look at things differently. We have to be more thoughtful and creative, and let's start challenging these notions of what we thought we could and could not do, and start really dig into the Ed Code and see where there are opportunities for change. So those are some critical pieces that I think in leadership we have to do, and we have to use opportunities, whether it's the pandemic or other conditions or settings, whatever those are, to really examine what we've been doing and how we can start doing things differently.
You know, and it's so important, I think, to having a conversation just this morning about the pandemic and what we think will be those lasting shifts, you know, in our society and education. I mean, you know, I was a history major, so I get all excited about these kinds of discussions, but so as you're seeing in your place in your career, you know, you're mentioning that this has been an important opportunity really to examine practices, you said, you know, educational codes and these mandates and things like that. One of the things we had asked Denise to do at one point was to vision the future for us. So we'd kind of love if you have a crystal ball there and you want to dust it off for us a little bit. But what do you think are you going to see in the next 5 years, maybe 10 years out?
Well, I'm hopeful. You know, this is a system that's highly regulated. You know, one of the conditions that we've been talking about is sort of the attendance accounting mechanism. In particular, what does or does not support us from pivoting quickly when we go from online to back to in-person to back to online, depending on if it's synchronous or asynchronous, determines how you do coding for attendance accounting in order to claim apportionment. I mean, there's something absurd about that. We have to be honest about the fact that there's something absurd about having to think through all of those pieces in order to be responsive to serving students quickly and in the best way that we can. So my hopefulness is that we will begin to dig a little deeper at all of these Ed codes and Title V guidelines from the Chancellor's Office, and really start to push on those a little bit more and rethink some of those things. We have seen that happen, for example, on correspondence courses. Many colleges, community colleges, started doing correspondence courses in the California State prison facilities. Solano College was one of the first to do in-person instruction only at California State Prison Solano and the California Medical Facility, which are located in Vacaville, where we also have a center. And then having to shift to correspondence when the pandemic started. And how effective are we in teaching through that correspondence method? And did we have to do a substantive change report for accreditation for that? Or were we able to say, no, here's how we can ensure quality teaching and learning will happen in this particular format? So my hope is that we look at a lot of the attendance accounting methods that we require, that we look at what we ask colleges to do in order to report any changes. Our curriculum review process at each of the colleges, sometimes it could take a year or two. Other places have methods in which they use to fast track changes in curriculum. And I get that, you know, we're the largest public system in the world. And as people say, it's hard to move a big ship quickly. And at the same time, if you're headed for dry land, you got to move that ship quickly. And you have to look at where some of the limits are and what are some of the things that maybe we need to really revisit those and remove them. You know, I'll give another example of where we've done that. Folks may not remember that in the Ed Code, there's a section that said if you had a drug offense or sex offense, had a record, that community college couldn't hire you. Well, through the Fair Chance Act, through Ban the Box movement, through conversations that some of us led statewide, and working with Chancellor's Office legal department, we were able to say, here's another way to interpret the education code without violating it, without changing it, and still complying with the Ban the Box movement, the Fair Chance Act, and being able to employ individuals who, for example, for us, were our previous students and who really had some skills that we needed here. So that is something that I really want to encourage all of us, regardless of our title, regardless of where we are in the organization, that we have to start looking at those long-standing practices and say, wait a minute, we need to revisit this.
You know, and as I read so much about what's going on in our country, you know, as far as the higher education world, and you know, enrollment significantly down in our community colleges. And I know California in particular, I think, has seen that. And also a concern about who is not coming to college now. And that tends to be our students of color, our under-resourced students, our low-income students. And looking at this trend as well, and a desire to increase credentials for adult students. That I know that's a lot, right? When we look at kind of who's coming to our institutions or who is not coming to our institutions. But that's so important as you talk about equity and access. So thoughts about, how can we, as we're taking down these barriers, making sure that we're really reaching out to those students to say, there's a place for you here. And I'm thinking about, in particular, some of the thoughts about credentialing, getting students, through programs a little more rapidly so they can get out into our workforces. I loved your example of the students that you had, educated who you then needed to hire, and maybe trying to think creatively of how you can make sure that happens.
This system is built really to accommodate those of us who work in it. We have legislation about shared governance, about authority, about curriculum, about what it has to look like. And then it means it's a little bit more challenging to then introduce this, well, here's what students are saying they want or need. And how do we go about responding to what students or potential students are looking for or are asking for? That is, I think, a constant sort of give and take that we're struggling with here in the system. I get that we all have these responsibilities and our roles and certain authority. I can't dictate the curriculum under the Ed Code. I also am concerned about how long it takes us to respond to changes that need to be made in our curriculum. And I have concern about maybe that's just not all that attractive for a lot of students. I mean, folks may recall that when University of Phoenix started, this concept of fully online and these short-term courses in which to move quickly through a degree, is blasphemy for some folks in higher education, and they're not going to get a quality education. Well, in fact, there are many folks who have gone through those programs successfully and have a quality education and know that that can work. So I think all of us need to find ways in which we can keep asking the question, well, why can't we do this differently? Mm-hmm. And what is the value of certification? Is there value? And why do students have to declare, a major in their first semester? What happened to the value of exploration? How do we guide students through exploration, helping them to identify strengths? So I think these are the difficult questions for which I don't know that I have answers or strategies for. I think those are the challenges that I'm looking for help with.
Well, fear not, we don't ask for, as I promised you, you don't have to be the expert. And I love that, that ties so nicely back into that team building, right? It takes having a team, whether that's at your institution or within your system or the folks who support you, professionally outside of those kinds of areas. You made a point about listening to students and it was one of Denise's favorite things, I think, to do was to make sure we were listening to our students. And so, and I also have seen, working in systems that sometimes the two people who maybe don't get quite as much listened to, that's not good English, my mother would be horrified, are sometimes our students and then our younger staff people, right? They just don't have that voice. Maybe they're not at the table, and yet often those are the folks who are most intimately aware of what is going on, right? In the hourly experience of being students at our institutions. So recommendations, thoughts, are there ways that you're listening to those voices that you find particularly helpful, or just making sure that, when we're sitting down at our tables to make decisions, that it's not me in a vacuum, thinking, well, I've read this policy, the Chronicle of Higher Ed had this piece. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I think this is always a challenge also in the role of superintendent president, is that there are a lot of things to attend to and folks to attend to, and it becomes convenient to then have other folks do the work of listening to students and having the conversations and deciphering sort of what students are and are not saying about their experiences here. And so I think one of the challenges is encouraging staff, supervisors, managers at all levels to really enlist students to become student workers on campus. I think that is one of the intimate ways in which we find out what the student experience is like, both as a student in a classroom and a student receiving services. I think that's also the number one way to retain students, frankly, is by having them as student employees, because there's levels of accountability that are built in there for both the student as an employee to a supervisor or to colleagues, and then the student in the classroom setting. And I think accountability is a big feature that helps with retention and also creates clarity for students and for us to better understand what needs to be happening. Now, I will say to you that students, it's not their job to come here and tell us how we should be doing things. We shouldn't be expecting that of them. We need to have those skills. We need to have the ability to decipher what it is that students need based on things that are or are not occurring. And so what I don't like to do is say, well, what are the students saying about this as the only way in which we gather data or information? Or, folks want to say, well, the students are going to take care of this. Well, as students, we all need guidance. We need help understanding the organizational structure. We need help understanding sort of how do we participate in a way that still allows us to be students, which is our primary goal and interest. So that's why I always think about on-campus work as one of those ways in which to enlist students to help an organization think about what we can be doing differently and how we can do it better. And then also really helps students understand how to build relationships on campus and keep them here on campus. So that's one strategy that I think about. I think all of the surveys, of course, are all essential, but when I go out on campus and student doesn't know who I am, I'm just there. And it looks like maybe I'm a grown-up and they can ask me, hey, I'm looking for such and such. I don't know that students care what my role is as much as, can you answer my question right now and can you help me? And then helping them think about, once you do that, make sure you do such and such, make sure you find out about, the textbook rental that's available, and you can get information about that. So I think those are ways that we don't think about, in which we really can touch students and help them be more successful as students, and then also help us in better understanding what students need when they're here on campus.
It's such an interesting, I know there are 4-year models where students work, right, as part of their experience in an institution. I don't know of any 2-year institutions where that's the model, but I also know that I've never worked with a student employee who hasn't graduated. And many of them go on to work in education in some way, shape, or form, because that's an intriguing and what an important point you make, because you're right, our students, their role is not to tell us what we are or not doing well. And I think sometimes we're guilty about relying on them too much in that way.
Yeah.
A really important point. So to kind of do a few touch points on the questions that I had prepared for you. Sorry, Celia, I tend to kind of jump a little bit all over the place, but I appreciate so much I've taken copious notes as you've been talking. Team building. You mentioned, the importance of making sure that we've got teams that represent lots of different, that they're not all Celia followers, yes, recommendations for how we can really build some teams. Is there, again, any resources? This kind of last question is, resources you might use to guide your work? But
yeah,
would just love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think about, the Good to Great, Collins book from some time ago. I really like to do strengths-based team building. And among managers, that's easy to do because you rely on the and other duties as assigned part of the job announcement. But what I like to do is really identify what do folks like doing, and that's something they usually do well. And then have them take responsibility for doing that particular work. So it's not driven by the job title or where they're situated or whether they're an academic dean or student services vice president. The question is, where do the strengths lie? And how do we do a strengths-based approach to creating a leadership team that we really get the best out of folks? And I think that's key. I always will say, we hire for character and we'll teach the skills a little later. That's a little easier. But folks with integrity and commitment. And I like folks who are open to coaching. I think that is a real quality that we often do not think about often enough when we're doing hiring. But I've always found that folks who are open to coaching tend to do really very well. And they stretch and they're willing to ask questions, and they're willing to also learn to be resourceful and looking for answers. and bringing ideas to the table. So, that ability to be coachable, to be open, focusing on strengths, I think are just some of the ways in which you build a team. Then there's got to be a level of integrity that folks have to operate with. And, we all have our different definitions of what that looks like. I want folks to be able to see where they are contributing members of the college community. Where do they do their best work? Are they heard? If not, what other spaces do we need to create where folks can be heard? And so I expect all of us in our roles, regardless of whether we are faculty or managers or staff, but really to create space where folks can be heard, because that really strengthens us as an organization to be able to look at things differently, to have fresh ideas, and to really capitalize on the strengths that people bring to the campus.
How do you go about doing, like within your year, for example? We're just also busy doing, right? There is so much work to be done that it takes, I think, some, in my experience at least, real thought to setting aside time to do strengths assessment, to do this kind of these team building activities. You mentioned being coachable, wondering if you actually, have any formal kind of coaching or mentoring sort of programs with staff. And I'm really intrigued by this because I am seeing so many talented people leave student services, and they're leaving in what I am seeing for two reasons. One, there are simply not a clear path for professional growth and development, and two, the position or available is no longer really flexible to the fact that they have children or just any number of things. So.
Yeah. When I got hired here at Solano College, and one of the questions was about professional development, and I said, professional development begins at home and it happens every day. It's not just going to conferences. It's not, going to get additional degrees or certificates. It's really a practice that has to happen every day at home, and folks have to have a commitment to supporting professional development. So, whether it is an opportunity for folks to submit innovative ideas to a staff meeting, or for folks to ask questions like, well, why can't we do that? And for someone else being willing to say, yeah, why can't we do that? Let's look at how we can do that. I think the working remotely is a great example. I think it's fair to say that at least in California, there weren't a lot of California community colleges that were allowing folks to work remotely, except maybe for Calbright. But the rest of us who are more traditional brick and mortar campuses probably were not thinking about working remotely. I know for us, we have had incredible effectiveness, frankly, with folks working remotely. Fewer grievances, fewer claims about harassment, fewer complaints, fewer employee squabbles, and folks have felt really good about how productive they've been working remotely. And so the question might be, okay, well, we're all going to be coming back at some point in our lifetime. And so we'll just all roll back in 5 days a week, 40 hours a week. And we're saying, I don't think so. Why would we do that? Let's take a look at what's worked. I mean, one of the things I will share jokingly is I haven't received a complaint from a student saying, geez, I really miss waiting 2 hours in line to see somebody at the financial aid counter. When are you going to bring that back? So we haven't had that. And our staff have really done an exceptional job of being responsive to students via email, phone, scheduling in person if it's needed. And so I don't necessarily see that we all need to be back here 40 hours a week, 5 days a week, working some traditional, 9 to 5 schedule in order to serve students. I think students have found that what we've been able to provide them in the way of timely services and the information they need is working for them. So that's a new idea that many of us, I know prior to the pandemic, I wasn't even thinking about how we do that. So I think that's a great opportunity for us to say, you know, we can do this a little differently.
Mhm. It's absolutely been one of my most exciting things to see, as somebody who was, I think, one of the first employees to work at a distance for my institution over a decade ago, and have long advocated for students not just needing walk-up services, right? Our students are not really available 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. 3:30 on Fridays.
Yes.
Right. So I'm excited about that change that we're seeing happening in our institutions, because I do think we're providing better service to our students in that manner.
Mm-hmm. Now I will say that there's something to be said for waiting in line. One of the things that I used to do was work the lines, you know, during that first week of the semester. And a student would ask me a question and I'd say to them, well, here's an option, but ask this student behind you what he's doing in order to manage workload and course load. And so create these opportunities for students to actually enlist each other as helpers. And you know, what we found was that in some cases students were like, oh, that's a really good idea, right? Or the unofficial ratemyprofessor.com would happen right there in line. And for many students, that is something that is missed. So what my suggestion is, we need to find a balance where we create those opportunities for students to engage with their peers for information and feedback.
Absolutely. I know that's something we're all, I think, eager to move into for this coming school year, because I don't know that it's going to happen this one, but for next year, that we can begin to recreate those opportunities for engagement that maybe have been missing the last several. Well, Celia, I just want to say thank you. I have taken so many notes. You know, the idea that we need to really examine carefully the processes we have, the procedures we have, the policies, the 3 Ps, as I call them, our policies, to say, how are they creating access? Are we creating barriers? And making sure that we're involving, you know, our diverse group of folks in having those conversations on our campuses. And it's just so I think important for us to hear. Stacy does have a question for us. The ratemyprofessor.com comment. This is a tool I have referred students to. Do you think there'll be a time when administrators might use this tool to help develop their faculty? Oh, as somebody who worked in faculty development, I feel like that's a $1 million question, and also the third rail, sort of. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I do remember a time when ratemyprofessors.com had just come out, and a faculty member came to me and said, can't you stop students from using that? I said, yeah, no, I don't control the internet, and I don't control the Rate My
But how
Professor.
awesome thought you had that power, Celia. Wow.
Yes, that was quite impressive. However, I don't have that. And my question was, what is it about it that's problematic? What can you learn from it? And then there might be some parts of it that you just need to discount and just not think about, right? Because these days, everybody has a place to give their opinions and their thoughts, and you have to decide how much of this is really valuable for me to attend to and how much of it maybe I just need to ignore. So I'm not saying it should be part of a faculty evaluation. I think it's helpful for all of us to take a look and see what are students' expectations that either are or are not being met, and then attend to those expectations at the start of a semester, right? And I used to share this with faculty oftentimes when I was helping them understand how to student discipline and effective classroom management. I would say, address student expectations, talk about students who were successful in your class in a previous semester and why, rather than, you know, you need to go to tutoring early on. Instead, share a story. You know, I want to tell you about a student who struggled with the first quiz, and here's what she said to me about what was really helpful. leave it there at that. So I think there are different ways in which we can use all of these resources and help them or help us be more effective in our work with students and help students manage expectations as well.
And that's just such an important piece, because I think, you know, a lot of the research I've done talks about that disconnect between student expectations and faculty expectations. And that's a lot of times when we lose students. My children are personally really glad that nobody's ever given me a chili pepper rating on ratemyprofessor.com, which, if you're not familiar with it, that's for all the attractive instructors. They think that would be really weird. So on that note, we have
that some faculty in some disciplines wrote about hoping for a chili pepper in their career.
It's definitely a tool that can be provide some opportunities for humor, which is not necessarily a bad thing in our world. So yes. Well, Celia, thank you for your time today, for all the leadership that you are giving us as far as recommendations, tips, and thoughts, and things to consider, but then also the work that you're doing at your institution and within your system. I'm just very, very grateful for your time. I know it's so busy these dog years of COVID, and I think you're right. I give you double the year's service for those. Let us know if we can write a letter in support of that. But thank you for your time. Thank you for our audience for listening in today. We're excited to continue our conversations this spring semester regarding leadership in honor of our colleague and friend, Denise Sweat. And we'll have next month, we're going to have one of my former students come back, Reggie Strobel, and he's going to talk with us specifically about supporting Black males through the college process. So excited to continue that conversation we started in the fall semester. So I hope you'll listen in. And thank you again, Celia. Everyone have a wonderful weekend. May there be time for rest and renewal, and an opportunity for humor too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Celia. Take care.
You too.